Now, here's a quick question. To-do lists, set ways of doing things, that fixed routine, order and regularity. Do you love them or loathe them? Are you the sort of person who throws caution to the wind and enjoys the creativity of always doing things slightly differently? Or are you someone who likes to do things by the book, to do it right, you might say? I wonder what your preference would be. I know what mine is. I'm the latter. I like lists, otherwise I forget. But some of us loathe that order and having to do things this way. We want to be creative and do things different. Well, as we look at this incident that Luke records for us, we see the synagogue ruler. We can see that he, like most, if not all, of the Jewish religious leaders, he was firmly in the camp which said there were rules and ways to do things and lists and order and regularity. And being so, we see that he was clearly indignant. He is annoyed, frustrated. How dare they? That someone could come and simply ignore all those rules and systems and just do what they want. This synagogue ruler would say these rules and laws and regulations, they're there for a reason, to make sure you do things right, to make sure you do the right thing. And of course, these are God's rules, so you can't break them. And as we consider this, we see that all Jesus has done is heal someone. And surely we'd say, well, that's okay, isn't it? So what's really going on here? Not so much with the woman who is healed or cured, we can see that. But what's going on below the surface? Why is the synagogue ruler getting all hot under the collar? And why does Jesus call him a hypocrite and then talk about animal welfare? Well, we know the history of the Jewish nation, if we go back into the Old Testament, their forefathers had disobeyed God, had been sent away into exile out of God's presence. They also knew that God had promised the Messiah. And so the Jews didn't want to make the same mistakes. They didn't want to be disobedient. They didn't want to miss the Messiah. And so they had taken God's laws, like the Ten Commandments and other laws that we see in the Old Testament, and they had distilled them down to the minutest degree, so that they definitely knew they were getting things right. And so with this issue of work, they had defined it down. So you'll remember when Jesus' disciples are walking through the cornfields and they pick some corn and they rub it in their hands and they eat it, they break at least 4 rules just doing that. The Jews had distilled it down. They had this list of do's and don'ts to ensure that they didn't get it wrong again, to ensure that they didn't disobey God. They'd started with all good intention. They wanted to live as God wanted them to live. They wanted to be the people of God. But over time, they'd allowed these laws, God's laws, the rules that they had sort of drawn out from them and distilled down, they allowed those things to become the master and control them, rather than being the servant to lead them, if that makes sense. They'd lost sight of the spirit of the law, we might say, and just held on to the letter. But at what cost? They were preventing people from coming to God. I don't know if you know the story. It's true that one of the worst train disasters in history occurred in the El Toro Tunnel in Spain on the 3rd of January, 1944. And if you Google it, you'll find it. And over 500 people died. The train was one of those really long passenger trains, and it had an engine at the front and an engine at the back as a reserve, or an emergency engine, if you like. The front engine was driving it. And on this day, the 3rd of January, 1944, as the train sort of found its way somewhere near the middle of the tunnel, the driving engine at the front stalled and the train stopped in the middle of the tunnel. With the train stopped, the driver of the rear engine, following procedures, started the engine up with the intention of driving the train back out of the tunnel. However, procedures also said that if an engine stalled, you were to try a restart, which the driver of the front engine did. And he did that successfully. So you can see what's happening. The two engines were working against each other. The drivers didn't communicate with one another. They simply followed the rules. And when the rear engine driver couldn't get it moving, of course, he increased the revs. The front engine driver did exactly the same. And they were in that situation for about 10 minutes, that vain attempt. One trying to drive the train out, the other one trying to drive the train back. And they simply adhered to the procedures, the letter of the law, if you like. And in those 10 minutes, over 500 passengers died of carbon monoxide poisoning as the gas built up in the tunnel. Neither driver thought about the passengers. They simply obeyed the procedures. And if we think about it and we look back to this account in Luke's gospel, that's exactly what this synagogue ruler was doing here. The needs of this poor woman whose vertebrae had probably fused together and who had been like that for 18 years, her needs were simply not taken into consideration at all by the synagogue ruler. There are 6 days to be healed. So come on those days, not on the Sabbath. Her needs were not important. Following the rules superseded the needs of the individual. And to prove his point, the synagogue ruler quotes the 4th commandment, well, his version of it anyway, that you should do no work on the Sabbath. Now, in their striving to define God's laws, the Jews had determined that to be healed on the Sabbath was work. Despite the fact that Jesus says to them, well, you'll unleash your animals, you'll untie your animals and lead them to water on the Sabbath. And so what we see is this synagogue ruler, although he claims a zeal for the law, he objects to an action that is actually in keeping with the law and which fulfills both the spirit and the letter of the law, to set people free, to release people from their burdens so that they can worship God. Like the 2 train drivers, the rules, systems, lists were more important than people. And Jesus rightly calls him a hypocrite for that. Because by holding on to the letter of the law, they had lost sight of the spirit of the law. It's been said that one of the greatest problems of a developed civilization is the relationship of the individual to the system. And what we see here in this account in Luke's gospel is that the Jews have put the system first And in so doing, they have devalued human life. This woman has no worth, no significance. The rules are more important. And we still see this today. It's very easy if we look around, and if we look in the church, we see it too. We might agree that the primary purpose of the institution of the church is to reveal the love of God in the community where it is placed. Be salt and light. You are my witnesses. And yet I'm sure that we've all seen and maybe been a part of churches where suddenly the primary purpose becomes the maintaining of the institution. And when that happens, the death of its primary purpose is on the horizon. And the result of this, the system comes first. The needs of the individual are lost. Human life is robbed of its worth and its dignity. People become simply reduced to a commodity. And Jesus, as he challenges the synagogue ruler, so he challenges us today. How do we understand the law, our rules and systems, and where do we place those things in light of the individual? It's too easy sometimes to be caught up in trying to preserve and maintain the way we've always done things, to the extent where it's very easy then to lose sight of one another. We see Jesus see the person first. We see how he gives this woman dignity and value. He calls her a child of Abraham. The Jews would have excluded her because she was crippled, and yet Jesus welcomes her. And he calls us to do the same, to put people first. It's easy to allow the way we do things to become the master, as it were. And then we start to say, well, they didn't do that right. They got that wrong. They mixed those words up. And we lose sight of the person. And we lose sight of what it means to be in relationship with God. And the challenge for us today is exactly that. We must never allow our way of doing things, our preferred way of doing things, our traditions and so on, to come first. They're there to allow us on that journey, if you like, to God. Our liturgy for this morning is simply a roadmap which leads us from the door to communion to the community. And we might take one or two sort of deviations along the way, and that's absolutely fine. But we should never allow our traditions to come first, to have more importance and significance than each other. We must never love our way of doing things more than we love others. Nor must we love our way of doing things more than we love God. Amen.